Thank you all for being here. My name is Lacey Abrego. I am a professor in the Chicana and Chicano Studies Department, Salvadoreña de Nacimiento, and do a lot of work around issues of immigration and how policies affect immigrants and their families' lives. I have the pleasure of introducing our first keynote speaker today, but just very briefly wanted to recognize the work of Professor Charlene Villaseñor Black, who has really done amazing work in pulling all of this together, and I want to make sure that we really recognize her for that. Thank you so much for taking this on. So today's first keynote speaker is Denise Gilman, who directs the Immigration Clinic at Texas Law, the University of Texas at Austin. She's engaged in extensive scholarship and practice in human rights and immigrants' rights with a special focus on immigration, detention, and refugee law and policy. Over the last year, she and her students represented dozens of women and children asylum seekers from Central America who were held in family immigration detention centers and advocated to end family detention. Professor Gilman received her law degree from Columbia Law School. Her recent scholarship includes the article Realizing Liberty, the Use of International Human Rights Law to Realign Immigration Detention in the United States, and it was published in the Fordham International Law Journal. Today she's going to be talking to us, the title of her talk is Unfamiliar Policies, the Detention of Central American Refugee Families. Please help me welcome Denise Gilman.
So thank you so very much for this opportunity to be here at UCLA. This is just sort of the perfect place to be. This event is a wonderful combination of ideas and perspectives and opportunities to engage in discussion. So I just feel really fortunate to have been invited to be here today. And in fact, as I sort of thought about it, I wondered why I had been picked to give this first keynote, given the amazing thinkers and advocates who are preceding me and who are going after me, who are really not just amazing thinkers and advocates, but also just really amazing people. I mean, truly. And I thought that the only reason that I must have been selected for this particular opportunity to give a keynote is that I'm from Texas, and that must seem really like crazy and exotic, and like I'm coming from a foreign land. I mean, this is the land of litigation where the state of Texas is suing the federal government on the one hand, saying that the federal government should not be able to decide just simply not to deport certain hardworking migrants who have become part of the fabric of our communities, contributing economically and in every other way. This is the land of the 3,000 detention spaces for women and children that we've been talking about and that we'll continue to talk about. And now it's also the land where a young child born to Sudanese parents was arrested for bringing a handmade clock to school. And so it must seem like I'm coming sort of from the belly of the beast and might be able to explain what this country of Texas is, this foreign terrain. And it does feel a little bit like I'm coming from the belly of the beast, and I'll try to explain a little bit of what might be going on in Texas. I do want to say that, of course, there are amazing organizing responses and other progressive thinking that are also happening in Texas on the immigration front. The Dreamer movement really started in significant ways at the University of Texas, at other places as well, but the kids, the students at UT have always been amazing. And so there's a lot happening in Texas. But still, themes relating to the unfamiliar and inscrutable suit me for this talk, so I'm going to go with it, that I'm here as the exotic representative of Texas. So what I want to do is offer some additional context on the detention of families to set the stage for the rest of the discussion in my talk and then for the rest of the day. And then also try to suss out some of what the concerns and issues that are really underlying family detention, what those are, and to talk about what comes next as well. I'm really fortunate that I was preceded by such an amazing panel. They already have touched on many of the same themes that I'll be talking about as well. And really, I'm just lucky to have a little bit more time to dig in deeper, and I'll be very anxious to get into some discussion with you all about those themes to see what we can figure out. So in terms of context, I did want to offer some just sort of background information. This chart shows the levels of undocumented immigration across the border, basically. The only tool we have to judge how much undocumented immigration is happening at the border is apprehensions, and so that's what everybody relies on, including the government. You can see that we're really at a period that's sort of a historic low, slightly increased from even a couple of years ago, but still a historic low in terms of border crossers. It's really quite extreme when you think about it. In 2000, it was about 1.5 million undocumented border crossers, and we're down to about 400,000 currently. Then when you think about what happened with last summer with the situation that was described by some as a surge or a crisis that we've been talking about, you can see that in the end, the numbers of families and the numbers of unaccompanied kids who were coming at the height of this sort of dramatic flow was about 120,000 total families and kids coming alone in 2014. And those numbers have decreased significantly since then for a number of reasons, including what has been mentioned, that Mexico has been deporting from Mexico more Central Americans than the United States is now deporting. So there are reasons why those numbers have gone down that are not sort of benign, but nonetheless, the numbers are way down now. But just thinking about it, so at its height, 120,000 moms and kids, basically. Did it make any sense to conceive of that as a true crisis situation, as a threat situation? As Steve said earlier already, not really. It didn't match the response. The characterization did not match the reality on the ground. I mean, just to put it in a little bit more context too, think about Syria. There are 4 million individuals displaced from Syria, many of them in the very small surrounding countries. So think about 120,000 moms and kids arriving at the border of the United States, this huge country with plenty of mechanisms in place to deal with refugee situations if we just followed our actual sort of procedures and framework for dealing with refugee situations. So the other thing that's interesting about just the actual numbers of it is where the refugees are coming from, or where these individuals appearing at the border are coming from. And as you can see, they're coming largely from the Northern Triangle of Central America. Most of you already know this, but it's worth just kind of seeing the numbers. Mexico falls down to number 4. These are the numbers for the families and unaccompanied kids, I should be clear. But they're not that different even from the broader border crosser numbers. Many of you have probably heard that according to serious calculations, it looks like net migration from Mexico is negative at this point. In other words, more people are going back than are coming into the United States from Mexico. And what that highlights, I think, is that it is a different kind of border crosser at the moment. And it is a situation which makes pretty clear that those who are coming as a way of fleeing significant violence. Because as most of you all know in this group, but I always try to make sure that when I'm talking to those who are less informed, I make very clear the situation in Central America is tragic at the moment. The human rights violations are significant and widespread. Honduras is the murder capital of the world at the moment on a per capita basis, and there are a number of other factors that are creating very violent situations in those countries. So faced with this situation of overall lower numbers of border crossers, but greater numbers of women and children seeking asylum, seeking protection from violence that they were experiencing, what was the response of the government? Well, it was a rapid turn to detention and deportation as the primary mechanism for addressing the situation. Again, these themes have already been brought up today. But we can see that it really wasn't a very logical response or even a good fit, really, in almost any way that you might think about a policy response for the challenge. So what was going on? And that's what I want to talk about a little bit now. So this conference, on its own terms, sets out to unpack the reasons why you see glimpses of progress in addressing the needs and rights of immigrant youth, particularly in the United States. At the same time, you see continued harsh treatment of adults, and in fact, a huge buildup here of detention. And specifically, what I really kind of want to point out as the tension is that the harsh it's not even this dichotomy of, well, more positive progress for kids and harsh policies for adults, for their parents, but rather particularly harsh policies for children and their parents coming together. So it certainly is not limited to the child-parent dichotomy. In fact, the mothers, not fathers, as we've already said several times, and their children have been singled out for some of the harshest treatment of all currently in the system through the detention and rapid deportation of families. What we are seeing is that some of the worst policies that were developed over the last year in terms of family detention are now kind of seeping into the rest of the immigration system. So we're seeing some of the what we call no bond policies. We'll talk about this more, but sort of no release policies for the families. Now we're seeing those come up for single women, adult asylum seekers in detention facilities as well, and men also. So you're actually seeing this as sort of a women and children first, in the worst sense of that phrase. Women and children first to get the most harsh draconian policies, and then seeing those going into other elements of the system as well. So what explains these contradictory phenomena? One of the themes that has been raised already is sort of the story of politics, and I think that's crucial to underline. The treatment of undocumented youth in the US is very intertwined as a story, a political story, with the situation of the Central American children and families coming to the border to seek protection. As Hiroshi already mentioned, as the president was trying to extend improved status for Dreamers, and to try to extend that even to some parents of U.S. citizen and green card holding children in the United States. The crisis was portrayed as such of Central American families coming to the border, and so the administration saw it fit to show that it was tough on enforcement, tough on border policies as a trade-off or appeasement strategy, which, as we have seen over the history of this administration, unfortunately, has been a common sort of pattern of an attempt to show get tough policies as a way of promising that there will be a trade-off and that we will get some benefit in the immigration policy world that frankly hasn't worked over time. But that was very much part of what was going on last summer, and it was easy to use this particular population as a way of sort of showing get tough policies. Recent border crossers are always sort of an easy target in a way. They have little constituency here in the United States that can stand up for their rights. They could be deported easily on a fast track, at least until the lawyers and other advocates got involved, and so their voices weren't heard because they were gone by the time anybody was looking, and they were being hidden away in these large detention centers in various rural areas, Artesia first, and then the centers in Texas are also quite removed from urban centers as well, although not quite as bad as Artesia. And so I do just want to give you a quick sense of what these centers were, because I think it shows the extent to which this was largely a political message it was symbolism to build up these centers and to place them where they were placed. So this is the Carnes facility. This was when it first was put up. They had to change it from being a detention center to being a family residential center. So this is the moment when they were actually changing the sign. I want to show you what was said about Carnes when it was first opened. Pretty clearly intended to be a message. It was part of the aggressive campaign to stem the tide of illegal migration from Central America. That is the press release that's still up on the website of DHS today. This is Dilley. You can see that while Carnes is basically an old jail in its physical plant, there are lots of cinder block walls, x-rays, clanging doors, heavy keys. That's very much the sense of Carnes when you walk into it. Dilley is this huge, sprawling camp that has been described by those who are quite familiar with it, this is not coming from me, as looking very similar to a Japanese American internment camp from World War II, and that certainly is the impression I've sort of had of it too. I went there for the first time in February. It was cold and rainy. It has a lot of outdoor spaces that are just dry and not with any vegetation or any real setting, but just sort of open spaces where people have to be. And it was cold and rainy, and then it went in June, and it was unbearably hot as people were walking around the facility without vegetation. So that's Dilley, and that's Dilley at night. I just think that's a really good image. I think this actually might be from the original folks from the Artesia project who first came down to Dilley took this one. And very similar explanations about what this is all about, the establishment of the Dilley facility. Explicitly, this is to deter others from making the journey from Central America, an explicit symbolism message of we've got to stop this flow, as Stephen said, as this invasion idea. So politics is a part of it, but it's also a story of money, and that theme has already come up a little bit too. These facilities are run privately, and there are huge incentives now that they have been built for the facilities, for the private prison companies who run the facilities to sustain that income, to ensure that women and children continue to be detained so that they can continue to make the money. And what that means is that they have strong incentives, the private prison companies, to put pressure on the policymakers to ensure that this goes forward. And so that's partly what the story is about. But it's also a story, one more picture of Dilley. This is actually ICE's picture, and it's interesting because I think ICE sees this as sort of a promotion of look at this wonderful place, and I just look at it and I see a woman and a child in a huge institution deprived of their liberty. But anyway, so that's just another visual of what the messaging is that the government is sending out around the facilities. So this is also a story of difference, otherness, familiarity. The families who are being detained are not familiar enough, yet they're too familiar. Hiroshi described it as sort of the good immigrant, the bad immigrant. I think that is a good framing. I also see it as sort of the familiar immigrant and the exotic, and so I think there's something to that as well. So on the sort of exotic and inscrutable side, this administration, I think, gets questions of civil rights. They understand the presentation of the dreamers in some way, that these are young people who have lived their entire lives in the United States, who may speak English, who are going to school here, and the administration sort of couldn't help but feel some connection to that, whereas refugees, Latin America, feels very distant and other. It was much harder for advocates and for the refugees themselves to make that connection to the administration. I really think there's almost a psychological, philosophical element to this that's very real. At the same time, this is all a little too familiar. It's a little too close to home Geographically, this is very close to our border. And again, this is a good place to stop, I think, and compare to the reaction to Syrian refugees. Not that our official policies have been significantly better on Syrians versus Central Americans, but I think just the way we sort of conceive of it, it's just somehow we can't think as easily of the Central American refugees as refugees, whereas the Syrians, it's just sort of understood that they must be largely refugees. And I think it's partly because of the familiarity. They're right there. They're so close to us geographically. How can that be a refugee situation? It's also a little too familiar in terms of our involvement. This was mentioned briefly. The fact that we have a whole history, a deep and pretty torrid history in Central America. So this is something that we've been deeply involved in directly as the United States. And so that makes it feel as though if we've been involved, then the familiarity means that for us to then turn around and recognize these families as refugees is to say that our involvement created the refugee crisis, which most of us, I think, would believe is in fact significantly true. But you can see why that level of familiarity makes it important to distance and to treat this as something that's happening outside of U.S. policy and that must be addressed as an incoming issue, not something we help to create and send. It's also familiar and too familiar in the sense that these are trends that have been seen again and again in the United States. This is not the first time that we have seen Central American refugees arriving in the United States in large numbers. And it's not the first time that the United States government has responded through detention and deportation policies. In fact, this is a repeating cyclical history. The 80s is, sort of the most obvious example of large numbers of Central Americans fleeing violence, coming to the United States when the violence overtakes them, just as they have today, and our response exactly the same. In the 1980s, there were detention camps built up along the southern border of Texas. Some people don't know this. I just had to go back myself and read through some of the history. The American Red Cross was even involved in setting up tent cities, much like Syrian refugee camps that you see in the countries surrounding Syria, and families and adults fleeing from Central America were not allowed to even leave southern Texas in order to reunite with families, and most were rapidly deported in the Reagan era when there was a strong political messaging needed to say that Central Americans were not fleeing a human rights crisis at all because of our involvement. And so again, in 2006, we built a family detention center in Taylor, Texas, the Hutto family detention facility, when we had more recent crises of Central Americans needing to seek protection in the United States and detain families there. We thought we learned in 2009 that it was a terrible idea to detain families of asylum seekers, and so the family detention facility in Taylor was closed as a family detention facility. And yet the same pattern repeats itself again in 2014. And the language that is used each of these iterations is very similar. They are unlawful border crossers, they will be turned back, and so this is a question of detaining them until they can be immediately turned back, and it's important as a deterrent to future families who might seek to come to the United States, including in the 80s, in 2006, and now in 2014. So now I want to turn to sort of what the current situation is and what's next. And I want to sort of start that by going in a little deeper on exactly who the families are who are held in the facilities and the impact of detention on them. In part to counter this othering, this invisibilizing of the families. I feel that it's important for those of us who have been involved in the facilities to make sure that we're being very clear with everybody we talk to about who these families are and what's happening. So I'm going to mention a couple of different aspects of who the families are. So all of them have suffered trauma. Really, everybody I've met in detention, I've met now with dozens of women in detention with their children. Most of the trauma is gender-based violence, including rapes and other sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, kidnappings by gangs that involve sexual violence as well. And the impact of detention on women who have survived this kind of trauma is grave. The women that I've met with are not just depressed, although they're frequently diagnosed by our mental health experts as depressed or suffering from PTSD. They are falling apart in detention. And it is true that they are suffering from the effects of trauma that they experienced in their home countries and often on the journey as well, and those are very horrific impacts even without the detention. But it's clear to me that the detention situation is exacerbating the trauma in a number of ways. And part of the reason I know that, part of the evidence of that, is that we know of multiple cases, several, where ICE has imposed very high bonds on women or has otherwise sent a clear message, reached a decision that they are not going to be released, and women have attempted suicide. So there have been several suicide attempts that have come sort of right after women learn about the fact that they're going to stay in detention, and they're so impacted by the fear of ongoing detention and the harm that they feel is happening every day to their children that they just don't know what else to do. Another characteristic of the families is that the children are very young. So unlike unaccompanied children who tend to be sort of closer to adolescence, the majority of the children are 6 and under. They're asylum seekers. As we have already discussed, Stephen explained that most are passing their screening interviews and showing that they have valid claims, and we know something about the situation in Central America that also helps us to understand that these are definitively valid claims. I recently read a report that described, I thought quite aptly, the decision to leave El Salvador to come to the United States as being sort of a dilemma of it being called a suicide whether you stayed in El Salvador or whether you came here and put yourself into the hands of the US government's detention mechanisms. We know their asylum claims because we're winning them. This family, who Cecilia helped serve as an expert for, won relief, won the right to remain in the United States, won refugee protection after 6 months in detention. The little boy was 9 years old. Well, he turned 9 while he was in detention. His student attorneys, the students in my clinic, tried to take him a cupcake on the day of his birthday and were, of course, turned away. It was extremely difficult to prepare the case involving horrific intimate partner violence. She was raped by her partner at knife point with a little 9-year-old boy standing outside the door. It was extremely difficult to prepare this case while she sat in a detention cell. And so then when she finally obtained release, the student attorneys commented it was so weird to stand there in the lobby of this jail with the clanging in the doors and the cement walls, and it took forever for them to process them out. And they finally walk out the door, and this is what you see. I mean, look how short she, a threat. I mean, they're just sort of the least threatening people that you can possibly imagine. So anyway, but we know they're winning their claims. Another important point is that almost all have family members in the United States who could help them and ensure that they are able to pursue their cases if they are not in detention. They don't usually come. Family reunification is a part of the decision to come, but the decision to come is mostly motivated by the violence. But once they're here, they do have family that can host them. This client of my clinic had a mother and a father who lived in Austin, where I practice, and they were being detained hours away. Yet they were detained with this 4-year-old child in Carnes for a relatively short period of time in the scheme of things of what was happening at this point, this spring, about 6 weeks. But that's 6 weeks of detention that has had a huge impact on their lives. The little girl, who's 4 years old, the mom told me just recently that they were at the grocery store the other day. She saw a police officer, just a regular Austin Police Department officer, and ran. Literally took off running. And the police officer went after her. He didn't know what to do. Maybe something had been stolen, maybe something was wrong. And the family had to explain her fear of authority, her interaction. And just thinking about what the prospects are for her development and her opportunity for positive outcomes in life, even if they win their claim in the end, which is still pending after having had this kind of experience. Okay, so I'm already starting to run out of time, and I do want to at least go a little bit more technical on kind of what has been happening with the litigation, so that we can then talk about sort of where we're going from here. Because there have been, in addition to the individual representation efforts, of course, multiple sort of legal advocacy efforts, and I just want to make sure that the landscape is somewhat out there on that to frame some of the discussion. So I want to start by saying that constitutional principles in the United States, it's true, constitutional principles in the United States, which really dovetail quite neatly with human rights principles, make clear that liberty should be the presumption. In our US system, we believe in liberty, and that migrants, even migrants, although there are these, it's true there's this sort of understanding of plenary power and certain discretion that's granted to authorities, but even there, even in the immigration context, migrants should be detained only where it's necessary, as determined in an individual case, usually to prevent flight or danger. Detention as punishment is unacceptable, because these are not individuals who've undergone any criminal proceeding. They're being detained in connection with their immigration case to ensure that they comply with the law, as Stephen said, to ensure that they appear for their hearings. But if there's no risk that they're not going to comply, as determined in an individual case, then they should not be detained. Liberty should be the presumption. So what happened? As I say, before the summer of 2014, families apprehended at the border were generally released pending a determination on their asylum claims. They went to live with family, and they were called into court. They still had ongoing court proceedings, and they mostly pursued their cases in that way. Over this last year, since the summer of 2014, with the rapid response of detention and deportation as the main policy response, the actual practices on the ground of family detention have morphed significantly and have changed over time, very much in sync with what's been happening with advocacy and litigation. So at the very beginning, in last June, July, August, what was happening is that families were detained, and then even after they passed an asylum screening interview, the government said, no, these families pose such a threat that they have to be detained throughout their proceeding. Plus, we need to make sure that we're continuing to send that deterrence message back home, and the only way we can do that is by broadly detaining for extended periods of time. We would then usually go into court, immigration court. Most people have a right to review that custody determination in immigration court. Not all have that right. And the judges would mostly order release, usually on the payment of some bond, which is problematic, but they would mostly order release. But the families were detained during extra weeks or even months awaiting that court hearing to determine whether they could be released. So then we brought litigation called RILR, a class action in the federal court in DC, arguing that that policy of detaining people even after they'd been screened without any individualized determination on this deterrence rationale, we argued that that was unconstitutional. And the DC District Court agreed with us. The DC court said that deterrence is really a concept from the criminal justice system. It's something that you use after there's been a finding of guilt and a criminal conviction as a criminal justice concept, and that it shouldn't be used in the civil detention context. So DHS said essentially, okay, we won't use deterrence anymore. We'll start doing individualized determinations, they say. And they just started setting really high bonds for everybody. And so the women and children still couldn't go out and still had to wait and go before the immigration court before they would finally get some relief and an ability to be released. So detention was still quite prolonged. And in fact, even though DHS says that they are not engaging in deterrence-based reasoning anymore, the very high bonds certainly gave a sense that this was still a deterrence matter. And even in the most recent briefing that the government has done in the legal cases, the brief says that family detention provides DHS with a critical tool for enforcing the immigration laws, which in turn disincentivizes future surges of families crossing the border. So there's still very much a deterrence thread underlying what's happening. In fact, the facilities were built for deterrence and they're still there. So inherently, this issue is still very much there. Then came the Flores enforcement action. And I know that you'll hear from others who will talk more in depth about that later, but I do just want to mention it really quickly. The Flores settlement is a 1997 settlement which says that kids should generally be released. They should not be detained. And that they should be released to their parents, even if their parents are undocumented. And if their parents aren't available at all, aren't in the country, then there's a sequence of people that they can be released to. So there was an enforcement action brought saying, well, these kids are detained with their parents, and they're also being detained in unlicensed secure facilities, which Flores also prohibits, even for the time periods when children do need to be detained while they reunite with family. So these facilities violate the terms of that old agreement. And in the process of that litigation, we now have a very good order from the judge in that case, sitting right here in Los Angeles, as many of you probably know. And we're waiting to see exactly what the compliance will be. The deadline for compliance with her order is October 23rd. But even in the lead up to that decision from the court here in Los Angeles, DHS again began to change its policy and basically started releasing families after they passed the screening interview. Whereas before it was an across-the-board policy of detain everybody, even after the screening interview, throughout their entire case until we can get them deported, and oh, whoops, some may actually win. Then it became a policy of, okay, after the screening interview, we will mostly release. But what they're doing is they're releasing most everybody, most families, on electronic ankle monitors, which is much like detention for deterrence, much like bond, absolutely a concept from the criminal justice system. And it is also, once again, being imposed essentially completely across the board. So liberty is not the presumption with individual decisions about those few cases where a real risk is presented. Rather, it's just sort of the next across-the-board policy. We've swung from one to the next. The government has swung from one to the next of these restrictive of liberty policies, adopting them across the board, and the ankle monitors are the latest in that. So really where this takes me, and I promise I'll sort of try to start wrapping up now, but I just wanted to lay out that changing sequence and the lack of individualized consideration and the lack of a real sort of belief in the presumption of liberty that is supposed to undergird our entire system. Because I think what it shows us is that if there really isn't a presumption of liberty, if there really isn't individualized consideration that detention is necessary in a particular case, then that means that it must be punitive. That the only real explanation for this detention is essentially to punish families who are arriving at our border. Not thinking about this necessarily completely as a legal question or a term of art of what does punitive versus non-punitive mean, but just thinking about it in very sort of real human terms. What's happening here? They're punishing these families for making the decision to come to the United States to seek protection. And so that's, I think, sort of the current state of play of what we need to be concentrating on to try to end family detention. The impacts of detention for even very short periods are very real. So to be clear, so now what I would say the current state of play is that families are typically detained for about a month. And Stephen and I, we have some statistics, we can talk more about that, but I would say about a month, maybe even a little less. The court sort of suggests that maybe 20 days. would be sort of possibly appropriate. But our mental health experts say that the impacts of even that kind of short-term detention are very significant. Trauma survivors need autonomy, security, possibility to reestablish familial relations and other caring, trusting relationships. Detention intervenes in all of that, interferes with all of that. It interferes with normal family dynamics. The guards are in charge of deciding what happens to the children, when they'll eat, when they'll take water for a cold, when they need some quiet time, not the parents. That destroys sort of normal child rearing dynamics. The children do not have the same developmental opportunities in detention that they would normally have. Normally, children are outside, they're having developmental experiences. They're deprived of those while they remain in detention at the same time that they're experiencing the additional developmental stressor of being confined, of having their liberty deprived. And then there's medical, just pure medical consequences to this. Where's our doctor? I wanted to grab him again. The medical situation at the facilities are very problematic. Currently at Dilley, the women and children have to wait in long lines in the sun to get medical treatment, often after waiting an entire day to be turned away. There was an overdose of a hepatitis vaccine that 200 kids received as a result of the type of medical situation that's being handled there. So the consequences of even this relatively short-term detention are significant. So the bottom line conclusion, to my mind, is that whatever the underlying motivations are, whatever is happening here, is the detention of families in secure lockdown facilities is incompatible with basic principles of justice and liberty, and it just simply cannot be done humanely, even for short periods of time. Our society cannot accept this response to refugees who should be received with compassion. And I believe that so deeply that I actually think that this will not persist. I think change will happen. I think family detention will end because it is just so incompatible with our basic principles, and because I believe that the women will make sure that it changes. The women and children. These women and children are an inspiration. These moms, I mean, every time I think about it, truly, I just hope that if I were in this situation with my children, that I would do the same thing. I don't know how they find it within themselves to try to bring their children to safety, only to see their children be harmed in this detention setting. But they are powerful. This really is one of those situations where they are not just victims. They are certainly victims of a state policy, but they are also spokespeople and advocates. This is the client that Cecilia helped with expert testimony after she won and after she was released, speaking at a Democratic Members of Congress press conference on Capitol Hill with Luis Gutierrez telling her she was his hero. That's the power of the families. They're faithful. They are largely very religious families. It's another characteristic. They have great faith that in the end, the reality will be different. And I want to work with that faith to make sure that it's right. And I look forward to a conversation with all of you about how we can make that happen. So I'd love to take questions and start a conversation.
First of all, thank you for the well presentation. You touch about a lot of issues that are very pertinent, especially with the ankle. Because you're right, I've seen a growing concern about that. Question, do we have any data on how many of the detainees, you mentioned a little bit that have families that they could, do we have any data on that? How much, what percentage of that are detained have families?
You know, I almost think the data on this is sort of the easiest one at all. I don't know if you have an answer, Stephen, but I've literally seen maybe 2 families that didn't have family members already here in the United States. I think it's a tiny minority. And there are, of course, some community-based shelters that can help with those small number of cases where people don't have family to go to. We have one in Austin. Casa Marianella had one client and her child, her 2-year-old son, who went there. So there are opportunities even for those, but they're the small minority. Do you have any take on that? Who has family in the U.S.?
I would concur. It's a very large number of individuals, either immediate family or different levels of connectedness. Yes.
Right. Not all documented, mind you. But again, another kind of important kind of point of comparison to make is sort of under Flores, what happens to unaccompanied children when they come to the United States is that they are, for the most part, held in licensed child welfare facilities. They're not perfect. I don't want to overplay the perfection of that system either. But they're held in facilities that are intended for children. And then there are pretty immediate efforts made to reunite them with family, even undocumented family in the United States. And in Texas, for the most part, that process really is quite quick. We're just talking about a couple of weeks in a shelter before being reunited with family. So it's just one more kind of clear picture of how much worse women and children are being treated when they come together, when actually they present in some ways an easier situation for the government to address, because children, you can understand, you can't just release a child across the border. You can release a child with his mom, who's already the custodian taking care of that child across the border after just some very, very basic processing. Yeah.
And along those lines, I'm a psychologist and I've done some of these assessments for kids, and recently I have seen a couple of unaccompanied minors who were detained with their main caregivers. I vividly recall one who came with her grandmother, but they were separated. They were detained and sent to separate detention centers. And I thought, how awful. I mean, for this kid was very traumatized, being separated from her grandmother, who was, her maternal figure.
Right.
She was held for about 4 months or 3 months, and she was the grandmother for about 5 months before they were released. Is that now a standard practice, or also separating the kids from the caregivers who they come along with?
Sadly, I think that's actually a pretty long-standing practice, and it has continued through family detention, because in that case, they would not detain grandma and child together in a family detention center because they're not mother and child. They've always been very explicit that this is only for parental relationships. And so, but it is, you are underlining a very important problem, which is that these detention centers, the government has partly always tried to justify them as being an effort to maintain family unity while the families are undergoing processing, when in fact, of course, it's harmful to family unity for those in detention, but it also inherently means that families are going to be separated. So what happens when a dad and a mom and a child come? The dad goes to an adult detention center and the mom and child go here. What happens when a mom comes with an 18-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old daughter? The 18-year-old daughter goes to an adult female detention center by herself, even though to most of us, she's also a child, and she certainly needs, after fleeing trauma, the comfort and care of her siblings and her mother. Yesterday we got out working with an attorney in Florida, a woman whose entire family, the mom and the younger kids had come separately. They were released after being detained for a period of time in a family detention center, went to Florida. The 18-year-old girl was detained at Hutto for about 4 months before she finally got released. Other questions? Yeah, one in the back there.
Hi, I'm Marilena Reese. I'm with the School of Nursing faculty. When I saw pictures of the detention centers and everything, and I've worked as a clinician in prisons and in jails, and they're mini jails. But we kind of seem to become, my concern is we become desensitized to this, and it's not out there in the media a lot, but they really are detention centers, and like Dr. Rodriguez pointed out about the fear, Ebola and everything. So I even had colleagues working at some of these detention centers in Texas and other places, and they took in a stride. They were getting hired to do the physical exams and just immunize everybody. And there's this fear, you know, and this marginalization and the racism and the hatred going on. But how do we bring back the humanity? Because this is social justice and a human rights issue, but we seem to have lost that. So what can we do to bring it back, to point out that these are inhuman practices we're doing to families?
Right. Well, hopefully we'll all go out and talk to one person, the next person. I mean, really, I do think my students commented at the end of the spring semester after having worked in the facilities, and my students are always the sort of, you know, progressive law students who are interested in these issues. They had no idea. And I think that's, you know, significantly by design. These facilities tucked away in the middle of nowhere, with making it very difficult to get the women's voices out. That's why I think it was so important that my client and other clients that Stephen and others have represented have been outspoken. But I think it is incumbent on all of us to really try to make sure that these voices are heard, to elevate those voices. I think it's crucially important. You know, the House, the congressional Democrats have actually been relatively outspoken, largely under the leadership of Zoe Lofgren here. Again, there's just a lot happening in California to help us exotic Texans a little bit deal with this situation. But I think a lot of work actually needs to be done on the Senate side. I don't think, so write your senators. I mean, really, truly, try to get senators involved. This is not an effort, as has also been a theme today, that is going to take place only through litigation. I wanted to outline the litigation platform for it in part so that you could sort of see what the limitations of that are. I mean, it has helped to effect change, very much informed by the expert declarations that our social scientists have submitted in the class action federal court litigation as well as in individual cases. But even with that, it's only going to be part of the overall strategy. We need to think of this as sort of, you know, a toolkit with litigation as one tool, advocacy, you know, sort of rallies and the rest are another tool, congressional work is another tool, and so, you know, really trying to think of bringing everybody together to make a change. But I think the sort of public education piece is crucially important. On that front, in terms of various advocacy strategies, I really did want to bring the medical school back into the conversation. The American Academy of Pediatrics actually finally came out with a letter. We had to work with them a lot, saying that they were very concerned about the type of healthcare that even could take place within the context of a detention facility. So it's partly about whether the subcontracted private medical services are adequate, but it's bigger than that. It's about whether, even if you had the best doctors in the world, whether they could really do their work effectively in a detention context. And so I think absolutely bringing in the medical expertise is crucial as well. And then just one final comment on, should I just call this jail or even better prison? That's, you know, we have lots of interesting debates among those who work on these migration issues, and I think that's a really interesting one. I personally don't want to call it jail or prison because it's not supposed to be. I'm completely comfortable saying it actually looks, feels, walks, talks like a prison. I think we should be saying that. But I don't want to call it a prison because it's not, because these women and children have not committed any crime. And so I don't want to link them to a terminology that assumes that it's a criminal issue when it's not. Yeah, one more question. Okay, great. Yeah.
On your last comment, actually touched on something that I was thinking as you were talking right now. I understand kind of the hesitancy of calling something a jail, but I'm wondering, because you said something about incompatibility with our beliefs of justice in this country or whatever. I'm wondering how that's true in our current context in the U.S. when carcerality seems to be central to the way that we operate and treat U.S. citizens, black citizens specifically, right? And those that are deemed terrorist or criminal, regardless if they commit terrorist or criminal acts. So I'm wondering how we link this particular thing that we're talking about, this moment, with the kind of perpetual impasse of racist criminalization of people in this country. It seems very compatible to me, but I'm wondering like how, you know what I'm saying? Like,
No, I do know exactly what you're saying. So here's the way I sort of see it, and again, I think this is a really interesting conversation to have. I absolutely think that immigration detention in general, and specifically of families, is very much a part of that picture of over-incarceration in general, and specifically of the disparate impact that incarceration has on racial and ethnic and other minorities. It's all part of the same picture, and I think we need to be thinking about it overall, because we also don't want to have a situation, just like we don't want to have the good bad migrant, we don't want to have the good bad this population, because they're refugees, shouldn't be incarcerated, but oh well, if they actually do have a criminal history, that's okay. And so to the extent I even fed into that a tiny bit, please stop me, because I agree, it's all part of the same picture. But I don't think that it actually is compatible with our basic principles. I think the trick is making that clear. So I also think that a significant problem of over-incarceration outside of the immigration detention context is the over-incarceration of people awaiting trial in the criminal justice system. There's been a lot of coverage. There was a huge New York Times piece on the use of monetary bonds to prevent people awaiting trial in the criminal justice context from getting liberty, which is the same exact problem we're seeing here. I think the broader problem is trying to really remind our policymakers, our public, our government that liberty is the norm, and really restoring the meaning of what civil detention is, which is supposed to be this extremely exceptional circumstance where there's a true need in an individual case, but really reminding ourselves that there's a very fundamental need of human beings to be free. And I really think more than any conditions, the conditions in these facilities are terrible, we can talk on and on about that. That's not the real issue. The issue is they're deprived of liberty, and that in and of itself has very detrimental consequences. And maybe we could live with those consequences if the detention was absolutely necessary, but it's not. It's not globally, and it's not because there's been no showing in any individualized case, no determination even that it's needed in any particular case. Thanks. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. And please join us for lunch now on the patio. We'll reconvene at 1:15. Gives us a lot of time to talk informally among ourselves, and thank you also to the staff.